Hello, and welcome to Practical Christian Lessons. Today, we're going to be talking about Leviticus 11, the animal food laws, and we're going to have some extra commentary on this one. Let's get into it. So, we are talking about perhaps one of the hardest parts of Leviticus for people, and that is the holiness code, which of course is most of it. But people also often struggle with things like the food laws, myself included, which is why we're consulting Geoffrey Harper on this today. In fact, I think his introduction is quite good. I've meant to do a deep study on Leviticus for a long time. I've covered a few chapters, but I need to do a lot more. But his opening section on Leviticus 11, I think, is great. Does it matter what a person eats? Or, more sharply, does God care about what a person eats? Leviticus 11 tackles these questions head-on as it constructs a theology of food, everyone's favorite subject. At the same time, Leviticus 11 is as engaging as it is theologically rich. This is a carefully crafted and artistically brilliant piece of literature, full of word plays and biblical allusions designed to capture the attention of God's people. This is probably one of the downsides of having to read via a translation. In the English, we don't see as much of the word plays depending on the translation we're reading there. But he is correct. It is very, very theologically dense. But we are going to get into it. I just threw my bookmark. Before we read the essay, to anyone who's new to this series, we are reading from the NIV Zondervan Archaeological Study Bible and highlighting the differences of the Old Testament theology of the Hebrews and the later Israelites between their neighbors as part of a demonstration that it is a unique theology that didn't just suddenly evolve out of the theology of their neighbors. Something different happened here, and you have to have an answer as to why. I'm going to say God gave divine revelation, and that is where these things come from. I do just want to note their note on the crawling things on verse 20. 20. They talk about, right, insects have 6 legs. They note that it's possible that the people of that time may not have counted the hind jumping legs as part of the legs. I can't attest to the scholarship on that, but I just wanted to note that. But this is clean and unclean foods in the Bible in the ancient Near East, page 168 on Leviticus 11. Here we go. The rationale behind the designation of certain creatures as clean and others as unclean for dietary purposes, as in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, 3-21, has perplexed Bible readers throughout the ages. Possible explanations include hygienic reasons, right? That pork, especially if not thoroughly cooked, could prove unhealthy and carry diseases. If you're ever in a survival situation and you get pork, cook it till it's charred. That's your survival tip. Allegorical explanations, which are rampant throughout the church fathers. I'll actually quote a few here after I read this. The notion that a character of certain animals determined whether or not they were clean, e.g. pigs were thought of to exemplify lazy, gluttonous, uncouth behavior, and thus were deemed unclean. To give some examples here of, especially in early church fathers, they often took an allegorical approach to the Old Testament. Methodius said on chapter 2 of Leviticus that the salt here is pointed to us as the offering brought forth. That salt was the meditation on the scripture, which stings in order to benefit and which disinfects. You can find that in the Banquet of the 10 Virgins 1.1. Again, I've done some study, including reading church fathers on these things. Gregory the Great in Leviticus 3 equated the sacrifice of the tail, the fat of the backbone, as the end of a body, and that person makes a perfect offering who carries out the sacrifice of a good work to its due completion. So when they're talking about allegorical interpretation, that's the kind of things they're talking about. Arbitrary testing, the idea that God randomly designated some animals as unclean in order to test his people's obedience. And pagan association, the suggestion that animals labeled unclean were those used in non-Israelite rituals, e.g. certain pagan rites entailed the sacrifice of pigs. Conformity to an ideal, the supposition that only these animals conforming to what was considered normal for their species were clean, e.g. sea creatures without fins and or scales were abnormal and therefore unclean. I don't put much stake in that one personally. And heavenly analogy, the notion that clean animals constituted God's own diet. If you read Psalm 50, actually I had that pulled up earlier, but he notes, right, if I were hungry, I would not ask you. I control the world. And, right, the world is mine. I can take what I want. And then he notes that he doesn't eat. Anyway, some of these explanations are plainly far-fetched. Indeed, the suggestion that certain foods compromise God's diet lacks any merit. It is important to note, however, that all of them are hypothetical, unsupported by any specific biblical teaching. Also, none fully accounts for the distinctions detailed in Leviticus 11. However, our friend Harper here has a theory I think does that. Regardless of which hypothetical rationale, if any, historians may offer for the diet of the ancient Israelites, clearly the distinction between clean and unclean foods ensured them a healthy diet and enabled them to identify as God's covenant people. Adherence to these food laws consecrated the Israelites, setting them apart as holy, just as Yahweh their God is holy. Leviticus 11:44 through 47. And that is quoted in 1 Peter again. That's something Harper notes, is that we can't just dismiss Leviticus 11 and Friends because Peter quotes out of it. He says, "Be holy as the Lord is holy." So there's something in there for us to chew on, to be nourished by. Although outside ancient Israel, there is no known system as comprehensive in differentiating between permitted and prohibited foods, right? Their dietary food law is expansive, especially for the ancient Near East. Dietary restrictions of one kind or another are attested in the ancient Near East from Egypt to Babylonia. Inscription in Egyptian temples included lists of food, mostly animal products, certain groups of people were not to eat. The cow, for example, was off limits in Dendera, where the goddess Hathor was said to be manifested in bovine form. Bovine is cow. In Mesopotamia, eating certain animals was prohibited on special occasions, such as rituals in which pigs were sacrificed. Otherwise, pork was widely eaten. Numerous ancient cults also had specific taboos regarding food consumption. Cross-reference Colossians 2:20 through 21. They also reference another essay in here on page 390 on food and culture. I doubt we're going to read that. I'm going to have to just put the bookmark in here again later. And, right, one of the things that does stand out is not just that their food list is quite so expansive, but it is that, what is the purpose of those food laws, right? Of course, they didn't eat in Egypt, right? They weren't eating that day in that location because it was like representative of the deity, right? But with the Israelites, right, they're not doing it just on special occasions. Though they do have that in, they can't eat leavened bread during Passover. They aren't abstaining from these things for ritual purposes or anything like that. They're doing it because it makes them clean or unclean before the Lord. And in another way, holy versus impure, and that, like we've been talking about in the past few videos, and the important implications of that. Go watch those if you want to hear my, I think, good but important theological discussion on the importance of those things. However, and this might be a little bit longer than our regular video, I think it's important because a lot of people are very curious about these food laws, is what is going on here in Leviticus, right? Peter's quoting from it. So clearly in line with Paul, right, who says that all scripture is God-breathed and for our instruction, for our teaching, for our correction, for our reproof. Something in Leviticus, then, is worth chewing on here. In this part of Leviticus, all of Leviticus. It's a deep book. I recommend this commentary, and Disciple Dojo has done several great videos on Leviticus and an interview with someone who wrote a commentary on Leviticus I intend to get. I recommend checking those out as well if you want to go even deeper. But we are delving in here. And of course he notes in here that there is a flaw in hygienic and moral, such as, right, you happen in Leviticus 12:2, is if you take a moral standpoint on what the animals are representing. Well, you have a woman giving childbirth being something that makes someone ritually unclean. Well, then that presents a problem if you're taking a moral argument, because childbirth is a blessing. It's a gift, right? Blessed is the man whose quiver is full. So moral has some big theological problems here. Unclean does not equal sin. These, as he describes them here, are states of being. And we're going to skip forward here. I wrote some notes down ahead of time here. So you're either in a state of pure or impure. You're either holy or common. And as Leviticus 11:8 notes, they are impure for the Israelites alone. Again, recommends commentary. It's very good. And we even see that even more clearly because the Israelites are allowed to sell pigs and stuff to their neighbors and to sojourners. So clearly it is only unclean for them. And it's not just touching and handling them, right? It's eating them. So there's something different going on here. Harper argues this is more about our relationship with God. That is what is going on here in Leviticus 11. And he does have this handy chart here. Here we go. Hopefully this isn't too unhandable here. That is page 174 for anyone who gets this commentary. We are going to read from 177 and 178 here. He makes some very, very important notes here that I did not pick up on my own. And I am going to be mulling this over for a little bit. Page 177 is Leviticus doesn't tell us why. That's one of the things he notes here, right? Leviticus doesn't actually give us, in clear words, a reason as to why. It doesn't say it outright. So take for that what you will. However, the text creates strong associations between death and impurity. This is something many people have noted in various commentaries. Right? Carnivores are not permitted for food, for example. Connections are also made to creation. Although not as immediately evident in English, Leviticus 11 is saturated with terms and phrases shared with Genesis 1. Some of the many examples include, as he's going to list here, and he has an extended discussion in another work, I Will Walk Among You, that you can read more on there, pages 111 through 48. But to separate is in Genesis 1:14 and 18. It's in Leviticus 11:47. In the seas of Genesis 1:22, Leviticus 11:9 and 10. To swarm and to creep is used in Genesis 1:21 and Leviticus 11:44 and 46. And that same language is also used of the Hebrews in Exodus. A living creature in Genesis 1:20, and then various parts up to 30, Leviticus 11:10 and 46, and then according to its kind, which is all throughout Genesis 1 and Leviticus 11. In addition, both passages divide animals into the same four categories: land, aquatic, aerial, and swarming creatures. The phrasing there does matter. The spheres they inhabit are also identical: land, water, and air. Note the reversal of order from Genesis 1, which is air, water, land. In these ways, Leviticus 11 repeatedly alludes to Genesis 1. I consider the theological importance of this below. And he's going to explain the defiling potential of death and land swarmers. We're not going to get into that in this video. You're going to have to get his book to actually read that. I highly recommend it. But there's also, that just reminds me of the Leviticus is sort of like a linchpin for the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. So it textually, explicitly connects Exodus and Numbers to each other. Leviticus being the linchpin between the two, right? It's the story happening between those two things. And, right, center of things in Hebrew literature and Hebrew writing is often a very important note. If something's at the center, it is very likely it has important significance, such as is very true of Leviticus. This is the holiness code. This is what allows the people to be in the presence of God and not just be smote. But as he's noting here, right, there's sort of this reverse ordering. So it's pointing you back to Genesis. Clearly in the Hebrew, it's far more apparent using the same words, same phrases. And I like that he's highlighted this here. But even in a way that it's sort of like reversing order, like you're here in Leviticus, roughly in the center, and now you have these reversing of the order of Genesis. That's also like to help you, it'd be a good memorization tool, right? Land, water, air, air, water, land. But this is the thing I think is super interesting here in his commentary is defilement versus holiness. Leviticus 11:41 through 45. The concluding paragraph brings together the various strands noted above: the defilement of potential and defiling potential of death and land swarms, holiness versus unclean, etc. Land swarmers are the only creature mentioned. Avoidance and consequence are made explicit. You shall not make yourselves detestable with any swarming thing that swarms, and you shall not defile yourselves with them and become unclean through them. That's verse 43. Here are detestable creatures that can make people detestable to God. The warning is driven home through the use of another allusion to Genesis 1 through 3. This is the important part here. The phrase in 11:42, moves on its belly, occurs in only one other place, Genesis 3:14, where the serpent is cursed and told, you will move on your belly. In this moment, the theology of the passage crystallizes. The unique phrase in 11:42 arrests attention and provokes reflection. In the garden, Adam was given a food allotment, you may eat, in 2:16, with accompanying restriction, you must not eat, in Genesis 2:17. Danger came in the form of a serpent, a land-swarming creature, Genesis 3:1 through 5. The penalty for disobedience was banishment from the garden and God's presence, Genesis 3:24. Now in Leviticus 11, Yahweh gives Israel a food allotment, you may eat, in verse 11:3. With accompanying restrictions, you must not eat, 11 verse 8. Danger would come especially from land-swarming creatures, 11:29 through 38 and 41 through 43. The penalty for disobedience was banishment from tabernacle and the presence of God therein, because one had become impure, in 11:24 and various other places. In this way, Leviticus 11 puts Israel into Adam's shoes. As in the garden, food becomes the marker of fidelity. What one eats or does not eat is deemed vitally significant to God. Adam bore the penalty of ignoring the truth. Every Israelite was now faced with a 3 times a day choice. Will I disobey like Adam and Eve, or heed the word of Yahweh and express faith through right eating? Worship of Yahweh intrudes into kitchen and dining room. Let there be no doubt, relationship with God is an all of life commitment. If you're like me right now, I'm circling that in my head. That is a connection I've never noticed before, and I love it. I love getting to chew and think on things like this. And whether or not his case is true, which I think that's a pretty strong case. There is absolutely textual allusions there. I think it's pretty obvious that reading his words, right, seeing how the Hebrew itself points back, there are absolutely connections there to be made, and I think it is making the point he's making. That's like, hey, as we talked about in previous videos, the garden in Genesis is mirrored by the tabernacle and the temple, and right, the structures are already mirroring. That's already pointing back to Genesis. Yes, of course it makes sense that the laws that make one holy versus unholy, or holy versus mundane, if you will, holy versus common, the thing that pushes you out of God's presence mirrors that which pushed the first humans out of God's presence. And that is a strong and powerful connection, and can possibly be like something that helps open you up to what Leviticus is doing. So please take that and go and read Leviticus. And I just want to make an important note here. I should have mentioned this previously, and this will matter in our Messianic series on the channel, is the tabernacle, the temple, not only point forward to a heavenly temple, as Hebrews points out, they point forward to Christ as well. That Christ is literally said to have tabernacled among us. That's the literal wording of that phrase, that he tabernacled among us. So there is a lot to chew on in Leviticus, and unfortunately, I've only gotten to do a decent a decent study on the first 6 chapters. I never got to delve in much deeper past that. And I want to. I really want to. Because there's so much there, and there's a lot to chew on, and it can be hard to get through a lot of it. But it's worth it. It's all good stuff. It's why you get commentaries, you read church fathers, you talk to your pastors, you talk to friends, you talk to mentors, find people to do these studies with. That's great things. So again, I'm going to link that Disciple Dojo stuff down below. Check that stuff out. It'll probably be in a pinned comment. And follow along the channel. Join us in all the various crazy things we're doing. There's a lot going on here, and it's going to be a lot of fun. You guys have a wonderful day. God bless.